Finding a new job is stressful. But with Indeed, it doesn't have to be. Just fill out your Indeed profile with your skills, experience, and desired salary. The more you fill out, the better your matches will be. And hearing from hiring managers will be 2 times more likely. Relax. That's your Indeed profile sending opportunities your way. Indeed, the world can work better.
New Vitamin Water Zero Sugar Pineapple Passion Fruit is packed with vitamins. Just like the amount of peas we packed in that sentence. It's packed like your tote bag. The one you stole from your ex. Or your overpriced half a studio apartment. Or extra rushed rush hour traffic. Packed like your calendar. Triple booked at 5, of course. Grab a vitamin water. Did we mention it's packed with vitamins?
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Tudors Dynasty and Beyond. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and I'm very pleased to welcome back to the show once again, Sharon Bennett Connolly. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you for having me again.
Well, it's always so fun to chat with you because you are like this wealth of knowledge when it comes to, in my opinion, women in history. I'm just so grateful for all of the work that you've done.
Thank you.
And today, well, that's good. Today, we're going to talk about the daughters of King John. And, you know, when you think of King John, you think of what? Robin Hood, you think of Magna Carta, but you don't necessarily immediately think about, oh, who were his daughters, right? Because he is just this big character in history. So maybe before we get too deep into the daughters, for those who are unaware of who King John was and why he has left such a mark on history, could you please fill us in?
Oh, wow. King John. Well, I seem to remember, I think we've already done an episode on his wife, haven't we? We did an episode on Isabella of Angoulême a while ago. So King John was married to his second wife, Isabella of Angoulême. He was king from 1200 to 1216. Sorry, 1199 to 1216. He wasn't a popular king by any. Although the main problem for John was that he had a falling out with the church. And they didn't like him. He didn't like them. And of course, all the chronicles are written by churchmen in those days. Well, most of them. So he got a bad reputation very quickly and very easily. He didn't help things by actually not being that nice a man anyway. But to be honest, he didn't do a lot worse than his brother Richard the Lionheart and his father Henry II. It's just he didn't have as good a propaganda mill. You know, he wasn't this crusading hero like Richard the Lionheart who can execute 3,000 men in one day and he's still a great guy. Whereas John puts a woman in a dungeon and forgets to feed her and he's a really bad guy. Okay, so he is a really bad guy. So was Richard the Lionheart. It's just Richard the Lionheart isn't seen as a really bad guy. So yeah, he does tend to come out on top or near the top of Britain's worst kings. But he is a fascinating character. And he fell out with his barons so much that they forced Magna Carta on him to try and get him to behave and stop stealing their lands and their wives and anything he could get his hands on. And he did agree to Magna Carta, and then immediately afterwards he wrote to the Pope and said, "Those nasty barons, they made me sign this Magna Carta, and I didn't want to. Can you tell them that it's not valid?" And the Pope repealed Magna Carta. And yet it endured, and it is, is the foundation of the British justice system. And it is the closest thing Britain actually has to a constitution. We don't have a written constitution. We have Magna Carta and common law. So he was he may not have been a nice guy, but his reign was pivotal for the future of England and justice. So it's thanks to him that no one's allowed to be imprisoned without trial anymore. And it's thanks to him that the government can't just steal our lands without actually us being convicted. So it's thanks to him because he was a bad guy, but as a result, we've got some better laws.
Well, and King John was never really meant to be king, was he? Because he had several older brothers.
Yeah, he was the youngest of five brothers, four that lived to adulthood.
Yeah.
Because he was the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. So he had, and his oldest brother William died at the age of 3. Then there was Henry, the young king, who died before Henry II, so he never became Henry III. Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey, who was Count or Duke of Brittany, and he died in a tournament in Paris just before, a few months before his son Arthur was born. So although John had 4 older brothers, only one of them had a son, which was Prince Arthur, who technically, if you go by strict primogeniture, oldest son to oldest son to oldest son, was technically the heir to the throne. But in those days, they weren't necessarily, that wasn't fully established. And there was an argument that the son of a king had more right to the throne than the grandson of a king, whose father wasn't king. So that's how come John became king rather than Prince Arthur. Then Prince Arthur decided to rebel against John, tried to kidnap his grandmother, got caught, and disappeared into a tower in Rouen, never to be seen alive again. Which is also something that's held against John, that he murdered his own nephew. But his nephew was rebelling against him and trying to kidnap Eleanor of Aquitaine. I mean, what did he expect would happen if he got caught?
Right. Just be like, oh, well, boys will be boys.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, that was certainly Henry II's attitude when his sons rebelled against him in 1173 and 1174. Geoffrey, Richard, and Henry, the young king, all rebelled against Henry II, with the encouragement of their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. They lost the war, but Henry was very much with the sons. Boys will be boys. Eleanor of Aquitaine, of course, was imprisoned for the rest of Henry II's life. So boys will be boys, but wives can't rebel.
Isn't that the truth?
It's very unfair.
Yes. Well, women did not have the rights that they do today, did they?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so speaking of women, I always want to get the timeline right here. So was King John married with kids by the time he became king?
No. He was married, technically. He'd been married in 1189 to Isabella of Gloucester. I think that was a marriage that although it had been agreed when he was a child by Henry II, it had always been held off. And then when Richard the Lionheart came to the throne in 1189, he decided he was getting his brother married off straight away. So he told him, you've got to go and marry Isabella of Gloucester. And they were married for 10 years. There was a little hitch at the very beginning of the marriage, which was the Archbishop of Canterbury forbade them to sleep together.
Why?
They were second cousins.
Oh.
So Isabella's grandfather was Robert, Earl of Gloucester, who was the half-brother of John's grandmother, Empress Matilda.
Okay.
So because they were cousins, the Archbishop of Canterbury forbade them to sleep together, which when you're king, not being able to sleep with your wife and have an heir is a really big issue.
Yeah.
So one of the first things John did in 1199 when he became king was find 3 friendly churchmen to give him a divorce from Isabella of Gloucester, which they did. It was, he became king in the spring. By the summer, he was a free man and able to look around for another wife. And in the year 1200, he decided on Isabel of Angoulême.
Same name, made it easy, right?
Yeah, exactly. Who at the time was actually engaged to somebody else, which was a bit of an issue. But her father decided that she was probably better off as a Queen of England than Countess of La Marche as the wife of Hugh de Lusignan. So he, probably with a bit of bribery from John, agreed to annul the betrothal to Hugh de Lusignan and marry her to King John. So this was 1200. Isabel was probably somewhere between the ages of 10 and 12. Probably not yet 12 of when they were married.
Okay.
I know it sounds awful. I don't think John slept with her that early though. You
Okay.
know, it was common for girls. The church had decreed that girls could be married from the age of 12, boys from the age of 14, but girls from the age of 12. But most people knew that it was a bad idea to sleep with a 12-year-old girl. You know, it causes them physical harm if they get pregnant that they're not going to recover from, like Margaret Beaufort 400 years later. So, but she didn't have her first child until 1207, which was Henry. So I don't think that she and John were actually acting as husband and wife until about 1206,
Oh,
possibly
wow.
1207 itself.
Okay.
So when she was about 17, between 17 and 19, she gave birth to her first son. So she was mature enough by that point.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
that's one thing I don't think you can hold against John that he went to bed with a 12-year-old. I don't think he did. Um, so yeah, John and Isabel had 5 children together. Uh, Henry was born in 1207, Richard, uh, a year or so after, then Joan in 1210, Isabella, and Eleanor was the last. And there's question marks over the year of her birth. It's been suggested as 1215, 1216, and even after John died.
Hmm.
So she may never have even met her dad, bless her, the youngest one. And then
Wow.
there was another, we're talking about the daughters of King John. And usually you'd go, oh, the legitimate daughters, but there's also an illegitimate daughter who most people know about, especially if they've read Sharon Penman's books, which is Joan, Lady of Wales,
Hmm.
the wife of Llewellyn the Great. So hopefully we'll get to chat about her as well. But
Yeah.
those are the 4 daughters who I like to all of them they're such different lives. And yeah, with John as a dad.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought up the illegitimate daughter. I don't know why I'm always drawn to those women because you feel like, well, not only are women in history usually kind of pushed into the shadows, but the illegitimate daughters in history are as well, don't you think?
Yeah, usually even more so. But I think John took a page out of the book of Henry the First, who Henry the First had one legitimate son and one legitimate daughter, the Empress Matilda, but he had over 20 illegitimate children
That's
and
right.
about at least 8 illegitimate daughters. And he was very clever in using those daughters to seal alliances. You know, he made sure they made good marriages because they had an advantage. They were the daughters of a king. So in marrying them to barons and neighbors with power meant that he was making a personal relationship with these barons, and they'd probably feel less inclined to revolt. But he wasn't passing on any claim to the throne. So you had the best of both worlds. You were tying these people to you, but they couldn't claim anything from you. So you weren't taking away any rights from your legitimate children,
Yeah.
but you were strengthening links with these people. And John did that with Joan. With Joan, he was like, she couldn't pass on a claim to the crown, but she could be this physical link between John and then Henry III and Llewellyn of Wales.
Yeah. Okay, let's just start with her because I think this is just fascinating. I want to know more about her, how she came about, like who was her mother, at what point in the timeline of children does she fall?
Well, there is a question. She not exactly sure when she was born because girls at the best of times are not noted down, and illegitimate ones are not necessarily. She first comes to the fore when John brings her to England a few months before her marriage to start her training, basically, and get her ready to be married. So she starts, I think it was the early 1200s, 1203 or 1204. He brings her over to England. Her mother was, let me just have a look. I think her name's Clementine or something. We're not sure. Clementia.
Oh.
Better make sure you pronounce that right, otherwise it could sound like something.
USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks, or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Visit USAA.com/bundle.
Bundle savings are off total premium, not available in all states or in all situations. To qualify, auto policy must be active prior to property policy issue, subject to change. Restrictions apply. Membership eligibility and product restrictions apply and are subject to change. USAA means United Services Automobile Association and its affiliates, San Antonio, Texas.
McCrispy strips are now at McDonald's. I hope you're ready for the most dippable chicken in McDonald's history. Dip it in all the sauces. Dip it in that hot sauce in your bag. Dip it in your McFlurry. Your dip is your business. McCrispy strips at McDonald's.
Oh, Clementia.
Yes. Oh God, I've got that in my head now, and I'm like thinking, no, don't say it.
Don't say it. Don't say it.
So yeah, so her mother was thought to be Clementia, and so she was born possibly before 1189, because I mean John had a number of illegitimate children, and most of them seem to have been born before 1199, before he became king, and some possibly during his marriage to Isabella of Gloucester. But we don't know. And she was brought over to England in about 1203, 1204. So I think she was probably about 13 or 14 or 15, sometime somewhere in the mid-teens. She was old enough to marry. So she was, so I think she was probably born in the late 1180s or early 1190s. And John arranged a treaty with Llewellyn the Great of Wales, also known as Llewellyn IV or Llewellyn ap Iorwerth, who is Prince of Gwynedd. And if you've read Sharon Penman, you're in love with him anyway, aren't you? He's a great hero, a Welsh hero. And he truly was, though, from what I've read about him, he truly was. And he was in his, I can't remember, I think he was about 15 years older than Joan when they married. And it was a way for John, like I said, it was a way for John to seal a relationship with Llewellyn without actually passing on a claim to the throne. But dare I say it, without wasting a legitimate daughter as well. Yeah. I mean, to be fair, he didn't have any legitimate daughters at the time. So if he was going to marry a royal daughter to Llewellyn, it was going to be either Joan or his niece Eleanor of Brittany, who's the elder sister of Prince Arthur. The problem with marrying Eleanor of Brittany to Llewellyn would be, well, she was a captive anyway as John's, because after Arthur rebelled, he managed to capture both Arthur and Eleanor. But Eleanor was a legitimate, and she was an heir to the English throne, and she had, technically, a greater claim to the throne than John did. So if he'd married Eleanor to Llewellyn, who was a greater soldier than John was, that would have only caused John major problems.
Yeah, that would have backfired a little bit.
Yeah. That would have been like, oh dear, why did I do that? Big mistake. So Joan was the ideal candidate because she didn't have the legitimacy to pass on to Llewellyn. And she didn't have a claim to the English throne at all. No, not even greater or lesser than her dad.
Yeah.
So she was a great candidate. And yeah, she actually, I've always been impressed with Joan. She maintained her links first to her father and then to her brother, and played her role as diplomat, ambassador, and peacekeeper to the full. She wasn't always successful, but she was always maintained that line of communication between England and Wales to keep the peace.
Mm.
I mean, to be fair, it didn't always happen. Llewellyn sided with the barons during the First Barons' War after Magna Carta, and there were a few other things, but there's bits where there's one scene where John was about to go off to war, and he received a letter from Joan that says, I've just heard that a couple of the barons are actually planning to assassinate your dad. So you might want to hold off on doing the warlike thing for a little while. And he did. He put all his plans on hold and stayed in London because he'd had this warning from Joan that something was afoot.
It's always good when you place a daughter in a position like that as a peacemaker, and if she's willing to still protect you at that point.
Yeah, and it's funny because I always think that I think it's great that she was like that, and I think it also shows another side to John, because she hadn't grown up with John as far as we know. He might have visited her mother from time to time. She grew up in Normandy, so he might have visited her mother on the opportunities he could get, but we don't know. But she obviously was loyal to her dad. So he can't have treated her that badly.
Yeah.
Because as we see it, he had an affair with her mum. She had a daughter. Next thing we know about this daughter is he's bringing her over to England to marry her off.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if that was me and my dad treated me like that, I'd be a tad resentful if that was all that it was. So there is more there from, that isn't written down, that's between the lines, that obviously John and Joan had a relationship, because she had a relationship enough with her dad to actually care about him.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And before we go on, too, we should definitely let people know that you have a book in process about this.
I do. It was originally entitled The Medieval Princess from Royal Daughters from the Conquest to the Wars of the Roses. It was too long. So it's now Princesses of the Middle Ages, Royal Daughters of the Conquest, and then there's another one, Princesses of the Later Middle Ages, Royal Daughters of the Plantagenets or something like that. So it's in the first one, the Princesses of the Early Middle Ages, that I look at John's daughters. Yeah. And of course, they're in my book that came out a few years ago now. I think it's 4 years ago, in Ladies of Magna Carta, Women of Influence in the 13th Century England. And they're in a chapter in that as well. So I've covered them a couple of times. And I always find them fascinating. And when I'm writing about them, I always find something new. Like I hadn't considered that about she must have had more contacts with John than we know when she was growing up, because of the way they had a relationship, so she must have done. And just talking about that with you now, I'm thinking, I need to remember to put that in.
Well, it must be quite a challenge when you're writing about women in history to find resources, to find contemporary records about them. Is it difficult for you?
It is. I mean, luckily, the era of Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and King John seems to be the era of chroniclers. We've got Richard of Devizes, Ralph of Dishito. There's loads of chroniclers out there. You just have to find them. And luckily, we do have archive.org these days, who put most of the chronicles online, which is brilliant because it just makes life so much easier for me, rather than having to go down to Kew and go to the National Archives. So there's those. There's a great resource called British History Online, which has things like pied proles and charters and so much. There's just a wealth of information. The problem is the women aren't always mentioned in there, so you have to read between the lines. You have to find where their husbands are and what their husbands were doing, and find a mention of so-and-so's daughter, and then you have to work out which daughter they're talking about, because of course they don't bother naming them. That would be too easy for us.
That's the thing with the BHO, British History Online website, is you have to become really good at keywords and searching
Yes.
and using different words to find different people and hoping that they pop up.
And different versions of the same name.
Yes.
I've been writing about Petronilla de Grandmesnil this afternoon, and it's great. Petronilla, great name. You'd think you could find it anywhere, wouldn't you?
Yeah,
But of course, in the Chronicle of John Fontosme, it's Perenelle. So it's like, oh, right. So now I've got to go back through and search for Perenelle everywhere.
Yeah. Well, at least you got that little hint, that clue. Yeah, I love using BHO. If you're listening and you've never used it, I highly recommend it, and it's worth paying the extra money.
It is a wonderful resource, and I've found so many things on there that's like, oh my God, I can't believe that I've got this, I can put that in, and it's like,
I love
there's
it.
just little things that you just all the not necessarily the charters, but the communications between the king and ambassadors and things. And, on this date, so-and-so sent some oranges to Belgium or wherever. And it's like, oh, why did he do that? Oh, that was because his sister was going over there to get married. And, but yeah, it's like a big jigsaw puzzle. History.
It is. That's
Especially
exciting.
when you're looking at the women. When you're looking at the women, it's just a jigsaw puzzle, and you're trying to fit things in, and you do it, and then you think, hold, and you read another source, and you're like, oh, so there was a different way to read that charter.
Right.
Okay, fine. I got it all wrong, but it's okay. It hasn't gone to print yet. I can change it.
Yeah, that happens to everybody, doesn't it? Well, we're talking about the daughters of King John, and I don't want to give away too much because I'm going to want people to go out and buy your book. But I find it really interesting that if Joan, the Lady of Wales, was born first, let's say before his daughters with Isabella of Angoulême, then it's interesting to me that their first daughter was named Joan.
Yes, because I think she was probably. It happens a lot that illegitimate children and legitimate children have the same name. In fact, it happens often that two legitimate children from the same parents have the same name, which can be confusing.
Yeah.
But I think John didn't want to. He could, with an illegitimate daughter, he could certainly use Joan again. So it was quite handy for him. And Joan was. It's funny because you'd think Eleanor would be the first name he used after his mother.
Yeah.
Whereas Joan was his sister, Joan, Queen of Sicily. But then again, if you're going to name a girl, you're going to name her after the Queen of Sicily, she was an incredible woman, Joan Plantagenet. I've just finished reading Catherine Hanley's book on her, Lioness Heart, and she is one of my favourites. She gets married at a young age, husband dies, she's imprisoned by husband's successor. Then lo and behold, your big brother turns up on his way to crusade, frees her, takes her off on crusade. And so I can understand that she was Joan's closest in age sister. John and Joan, they were raised together at Fontainebleau for their education for the early years of their lives. So I can understand that John was closer to Joan than any of his other siblings, other than maybe Richard. And also, it makes me wonder, actually, if John's Joan was born in 1189 or 1190, that would explain why she got her name, because Joan, Queen of Sicily, died in 1189.
Oh, okay. So this is the illegitimate. Okay.
Yeah. So you just made me wonder if she was born around the time of Joan's death, and that's why she was named Joan.
I love when my guests have these realizations on the show.
You can see the exclamation mark at the top of my head, can't you? I'm coming up with all sorts now after I've sent the book in, of course.
Of course. But that's the thing about history, isn't it? When you talk about it with other people, sometimes you have these realizations because you're saying these things out loud.
I mean, unfortunately, it can't be proven, but it's just like, oh, maybe that would explain why he called his illegitimate daughter Joan, because she was born around the time of his sister's death.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Of course, when he has a legitimate daughter, it's like, oh, I wanted to name her Joan. Yeah, go on. The other one's old enough. It's all right. Nobody's going to get confused.
Right.
No, they're girls. No chronicler, no historian's going to be talking about them in 800 years' time and then get them mixed up, are they? No, that's not going to happen.
Well,
besides, and John's going, besides, I have 2 wives called Isabella, so.
yeah, exactly. Well, at least his daughters are separated by countries, right? Because there'd be Joan in Wales and Joan in England.
Yeah, and then Scotland. Because Joan was married into Scotland in the end.
Well, let's talk more about Joan of England or Joan of Scotland and her part in the family dynamic.
Oh, she's another interesting one. I'm going to have to stop saying that, aren't I? Because obviously they are all interesting. And they are. Joan was Joan was born in about 1210. And in about 1214, John made an agreement with Hugh de Lusignan, who just happened to be the son of the man who'd originally been betrothed to his wife, Isabella of Angoulême. So Isabella had been betrothed to Hugh IX. John made a treaty with Hugh X, whereby they had land agreements and things, and to seal the treaty, Hugh X would marry Joan, 4-year-old Joan. And she was left in, from what I can tell, it's confusing. Either she was left in France to be raised with the family of Hugh de Lusignan, or she was brought back to England and then sent back to France later to marry Hugh. The sources are a little confusing, but basically from the age of 4 she was to marry Hugh X de Lusignan. Then John dies in 1216, and Isabella of Angoulême is not given a place in the Regency Council to rule England whilst Henry III was a minor. It wasn't common for women in England to rule as regents for their sons. It was common in France, it just wasn't common in England. So she may have expected it as a French woman, she may have expected to have a role. But the men basically froze her out. And she had no place in England. Her children were being raised separately, in various households, and she was like left in limbo. So, but she was Countess of Angoulême in her own right. So she decided, okay, England doesn't want me. I'll go back to Angoulême and rule my own county. Oh, and I can sort out Joan's marriage while I'm there, because Joan's 10 now. And she and Hugh could get married. She's still young, but I can. When she got there, she decided, actually, I'll marry Hugh. And she sent this long letter to her son Henry III, who was about 10 at the time, 10 or 11, saying, I've married Hugh. Basically, Joan was too young. Hugh needed heirs straight away. I'm old enough to give him heirs, so we're married. And I would send Joan back to you, but I want you to make sure that I get my dower first. Release my dower, and then I will send Joan home. So basically, poor Joan, going from being betrothed to Hugh X de Lusignan to being his hostage for the release of her mother's dower lands. In the meantime, Henry's Regency Council holding talks with Scotland. And they make this deal with Scotland, with Alexander II, that he will marry Joan. who's being held hostage in France. But it's like, no, we'll have this peace and you can marry Joan. If Joan doesn't get back in time, then you can marry her sister Isabella, but hopefully it'll be Joan.
I mean, how you must feel to be the second daughter, Isabella, then.
Yeah. Okay, so am I marrying Alexander or not?
Yeah.
Maybe, but not yet.
Yeah, exactly. How
And
confusing.
then, yeah, Joan does get back in time. Actually, they delay the marriage, so the wedding, so that they can get Joan back in time. Everything's agreed, and Joan marries Alexander II of Scotland when she's about 11 years old, and Alexander's something like 22 or 23, I think. And so she goes up to Scotland for her life in Scotland, which she's still very young, and Alexander's mum's still alive, Ermengarde de Beaumont, and she's quite a forceful lady. So Joan has a little trouble establishing herself in Scotland. Apparently, she was quite unhappy and didn't really find her own place there. And she didn't have any children, unfortunately. So, which she was never repudiated. Her relationship with Alexander just plodded along. But the fact she didn't have children meant that she didn't have, it wasn't able to carve out a role of her own as the mother of the future king.
Yeah. Did her husband, Alexander, end up having illegitimate children then?
I can't remember if he had illegitimate children. He did have a son in the end with his second wife, Marie de Coucy.
All right.
But they weren't, Joan, I think the lack of children put a strain on the marriage. But Joan found a sense of purpose in being the peacemaker. She did what all royal daughters were supposed to do. She was the diplomat and the ambassador and that bridge between England and Scotland that both kings needed. And when Alexander and Henry were on the verge of falling out over official diplomatic documents, it was Joan in a personal letter to Henry that said, listen, stop believing the rumours. It's not true. Alexander's your friend. Let's talk, keep the peace. So she actually, just like Joan in Wales, Joan in Scotland was just as good at keeping the peace as her older illegitimate sister, who I can't remember if she ever met her.
Oh.
She might have done. Later on during Henry's reign, because Henry used to, I think she did. There were meetings between the Henry III, the King of Scots, and the Prince of Wales. Every now and then they'd call for people to come to do homage to Henry III. And I seem to remember there was a meeting. I'm going to have to look that up and double check. But I seem to remember there was a meeting, and so they might have met each other. Because you think, well, of course they met each other. They were sisters. But Joan of Wales was, 20 years older than the eldest daughter of King John, legitimate daughter, than John of Scotland. So it's not necessarily, Joan would have been in Wales for 6 years by the time the younger Joan was born.
Yeah, that's quite some time. So King John's daughters so far, we have Joan, the illegitimate one in Wales. We have Joan, the legitimate one, now in Scotland, and her sister Isabella was supposed to marry Alexander II, possibly, but now she didn't marry him.
Yeah.
So what happened to Isabella then?
Yeah, Isabella the reserve, or the substitute, bless her. She actually stayed at Henry's court for quite a while. She wasn't married until I think she was about 25.
Oh, wow, that is older.
But she was married, or she was sent off to Germany. She became, like her great-grandmother, she became Holy Roman Empress.
Oh, right.
So,
okay.
Yeah. So
that wasn't such a bad consolation prize then, was it?
No, she was married to Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor. She died in childbirth, unfortunately.
Oh.
But she's one of those, you think married and sent off to Germany, and the empire in those days was the whole of Germany and most of Italy, all the way down to Sicily. So she was, she going that distance, she probably never expected to see any of her family again. And you do hear this all the time, that meme about, oh, my daughter asked me to treat her like a princess, so I married her off to a king of Poland in return for some land and never saw her again. And it's like, that is so not true. It's not, they didn't, even if they didn't see their family again, they communicated. They were the bridge, the diplomatic link between their homeland and their husbands. But with Isabella, she was basically married into a country that was en route to the Crusades, to the Holy Land. So she didn't see her brother Henry III again, but her second brother, Richard, Earl of Cornwall, stopped by and met her, said, has spent a few days with her on his way to Crusade, and spent a few days. In fact, as he arrived, he wasn't allowed to see her for a couple of days. And he had to wait. It may have been that she was ill or recovering from childbirth or something. And he had to wait to see her. But he didn't go, oh, all right, then, well, never mind. I'll go off on crusade. It doesn't matter. I don't have to see my sister. He waited around and made sure he saw her before he continued his journey to the Crusades, which I think is nice. And it's like, it's Big Brother looking out for his sister. And then a few years later, Simon de Montfort went on crusade, and he was married to Isabella's baby sister, Eleanor. And he took Eleanor with him from England. They had a couple of sons by that point, I think it was. And he left her in Italy while he continued on crusade. So it may well be infuriatingly, there's no actual outright record saying the two sisters spent a few months together. Nothing like that. But if she was in Italy, the emperor gave her a residence to stay in. You can't think it would be, even sisters that didn't get on would have, if one of them's been away from home for that long, you can't imagine her not spending some time with Eleanor and talking about old times and talking about, family. Oh, what's so-and-so doing now? And, oh, did so-and-so get married? Oh, and they've got a little one. Oh, how, they're going to catch up, aren't they? So even though it doesn't say it in the Chronicles, it would be, I doubt it didn't, it must have happened. There's no way that they wouldn't have caught up. So, yeah, it's that thing about girls just being sent off and never seen again.
Yeah.
She saw her brother, she would have spent time with her sister Eleanor. And she died in childbirth when she was about 32, I think it was. She wasn't very old at all, bless her.
Yeah.
But she did make an impression on life.
The one thing that is constant in history is human nature. We're all human. I think we react the same way to things today that we probably would have in the 13th century. And when you're separated from family, you're going to write them. Nowadays, we Zoom or FaceTime or email or text but it makes sense that they would have stayed in contact with one another.
And you're not going to pass up a chance to actually see each other physically and have a hug and just find out, see each other face to face.
Yeah, because otherwise it probably would have seemed quite lonely to be in this foreign place with a bunch of people you don't know.
Yeah, you read time and time again of how these princesses are sent abroad with massive trains of people, 200 or 300 people accompany them to their wedding, handmaids, ladies in waiting, lords, a family member, Joan of Sicily was sent with her uncle Hamlin Plantagenet, who were told not to come home until they'd seen the girl safely married and made sure that she'd been given her dower provisions and things like that. But then instantly after that, you see her entire household was dismissed and sent home and things like that, and maybe I think with Isabella there was one lady who stayed with her through even after she was married. So there was at least that one link to home. But most of her household who'd accompanied her were sent back to England because, of course, they were the wives of lords and that. So they were going to come home anyway. So you've got this image of until they get used to their new home, they're like this island where they possibly don't know the language. Marrying into Germany, I'd say she probably didn't know German, but she would have known Latin.
So good, so good, so good.
New markdowns up to 70% off are at Nordstrom Rack stores now. And that means thousands of can't-miss deals just in time for summer.
The denim section is unreal.
Why do I rack? All the dresses. I always find something amazing.
Plus, buy it online and pick it up in-store the same day for free. Great brands, great prices. That's why you rack.
Mic check. 1, 2. Are we recording? Hi, I'm Michelle Bernstein, an award-winning chef, restaurateur, and mom. I have a lot on my plate, including my psoriatic arthritis symptoms. That's why I was prescribed Cosentyx. It helps me move better.
Cosentyx secukinumab is prescribed for people 2 years of age and older with active psoriatic arthritis. Don't use if you're allergic to Cosentyx. Before starting, get checked for tuberculosis. An increased risk of infections and lowered ability to fight them may occur, like tuberculosis or other serious bacterial, fungal, or viral infections. Some were fatal. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms like fevers, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, had a vaccine or plan to, or if inflammatory bowel disease symptoms develop or worsen. Serious allergic reactions and severe eczema-like skin reactions may occur. Learn more at 1-844-COSENTYX or Cosentyx.com.
Ask your rheumatologist about Cosentyx.
So she could have spoken to her husband and his court in Latin because the nobility would taught Latin so that they could follow the officers, the religious officers. And communications were a lot of the time in Latin, letters, official letters and things. So she would have known Latin and she'd have been able to speak to him in Latin until she learned the German. And he possibly would have known French as well, because French would have been her first language.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't have been. My example I always come back to is Catherine of Aragon, because I just think it is really weird that a girl was betrothed to a boy from the age of 2 or 3, and neither side of the family, the two families, thought to educate the other child in the language of their future spouse. It just does not make sense. You have this story where Arthur and Catherine of Aragon meet. He doesn't speak Spanish, she doesn't speak English, so they have to communicate in Latin. And it's like, they've known they're going to be married for over 10 years. And nobody thought, you know what, let's just send her an English tutor. And can you send us a Spanish one?
Right.
It does not make sense to me.
Like you would want to make that investment.
Yeah. Well, every other princess I've come across has been educated in several languages. And if they've known where they were going to be married in that language, like the Edward IV's daughter, Elizabeth of York, she did marry Henry VII, but for most of her childhood, she was going to marry the Dauphin of France. And she was taught French. It's just common sense, isn't it? Yeah. Even if she doesn't use it in the future, it's going to come in handy anyway. It's French, it's another language. It's just for actually exercising your brain. It comes in handy. So the idea of these girls, most royal princesses would have known at least 2 languages, possibly 3 or 4. They would definitely have learnt Latin and French. They may have learnt English, not necessarily, but may have. Certainly from the time of King John onwards, English was more acceptable, a language at court, although it still wasn't the official court language. So John knew English, so I'm assuming his daughters did as well. Yeah. So it's just one of those things, things like that you don't think about. Everybody has this idea that girls weren't educated because they weren't necessarily taught to write. but they would have been taught to read. They would have been taught what they needed to know. And these girls, these daughters of a king, were going off to be diplomats and ambassadors. So they would have been taught how to talk with with other ambassadors, people of different languages, different races. They would have been taught diplomacy. They would have been taught politics, and to know who was the person they needed, like any diplomat or ambassador of today. Who do I need to talk to, and how do I need to talk to them? They would have had to know that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. Okay, so we talked about Isabella, and then you alluded to the youngest daughter, Eleanor.
Yeah.
Is there much to know about Eleanor?
Oh, is there much to know about Eleanor? Oh, Eleanor's a book of her own. In fact, a few people have written books just on Eleanor and her second husband, Simon de Montfort. But she was also, my favourite story of her is she was married at the age of 9. I think she was 9, to William Marshall II, Earl of Pembroke, who was basically the eldest son of the William Marshall, the greatest knight, magnificent human being who, if anyone has read Elizabeth Chadwick's book, The Greatest Knight, they're in love with him. A little part of me is in love with William Marshall. He's, we've talked about Nicola de la Haye before as well, haven't we?
Yes.
And Marshall was a contemporary of Nicola de la Haye, who held Lincoln Castle against basically everybody, is the most awesome woman in history ever. So, and his son is William Marshall II, and he married 9-year-old Eleanor when he was much older. And he died when Eleanor was about 16. Now, we all know what it's like to be in love when we're a teenager. And when that love dies, it's the end of the world.
Yes,
I'm never going to love again. I'm never going to marry again. And she was persuaded by her lady in waiting that she should actually take an oath to that respect, and she swore never to marry again, never to be in love again. When she was 15, it's like, oh my God, girl, why on earth this woman advised her to do that?
Yeah.
It's like, but Henry III was quite happy for her to do that as well, because as a widow, she was entitled to, thanks to Magna Carta, she was entitled to 40% of the Marshall lands as her dower rights as a widow. And if she married, then those lands would be controlled by her second husband. So it was suitable. The Marshalls were happy for her to vow to never marry again, so that the Marshall lands didn't get separated. And eventually, she never even got to see any of these Marshall lands. Henry made a deal with the Marshalls that they'd pay her a bit of money instead. And it was, Simon de Montfort spent most of his time married to her, trying to claim these Marshall lands and things, because they were having more and more sons and smaller and smaller patrimony. So she'd sworn never to marry again. And then she met Simon de Montfort. And she fell madly in love.
No, wait, she swore she would never.
Yeah, I know. Teenagers, what are you going to do? So she fell madly in love with Simon de Montfort. And apparently Simon intimated to Henry III that he and Eleanor had been intimate and were expecting, even though they weren't married. So Henry approved their marriage and got them hastily married, so that no baby came before the marriage. And then about 10 months after the wedding, the baby arrived. Henry put 4 and 5 together and worked out that 9 months wasn't 10 months.
Yeah.
It was a little miffed that Simon had lied to him. Well, I mean, no, he hadn't necessarily lied, because to be honest, she might have been pregnant and then lost the baby and they got pregnant again. We don't know. But Henry seems to have thought that Simon lied. And after the wedding, Simon, of course, had to go to Rome to get a dispensation from the Pope to get rid of this pesky oath that Eleanor had sworn, because he wasn't technically allowed to marry her. So he had to go off to Italy to the Pope to say, please, can you just sign me a piece of paper and say it's okay that I've married her even though she swore this oath, and, you know, preferably before the child's born so that he's legitimate. And whilst he was there, he borrowed some money, saying, oh, it's all right. King Henry will act as guarantor, but I'll pay you back anyway. I think it was from Thomas of Savoy who borrowed this money with Henry as guarantor. And then he went back to England and all were happy and everybody was happy until Henry got this letter from Thomas of Savoy saying, I think it was Thomas of Savoy, saying, Simon borrowed this money and he hasn't paid me back. So he said you'd pay me if he didn't pay me back. So Henry was a tad put out, a tad miffed.
I would be too.
Yeah. And this was about the time that Edward I was born, I think it was. And it was at Eleanor of Provence's churching after the birth of Edward that basically Henry III turned on Simon and Eleanor. And had a right go at them and saying how Simon had deceived him in order to marry his sister, and then used his money, you know, borrowed money using his name, and how dreadful it was. And they were basically chased out of England. And they had to leave so quickly that their son Henry was with his nursemaid at the time and had to be left because they were so scared of Henry's wrath. They had to get out of England really quickly, and they had to send for little Henry later.
Wow, that's a quick escape. Leave your kid behind.
Yeah. But that was the start of. Simon de Montfort then eventually went on to cause a rebellion with the Second Barons' War, captured Henry the Third and his son Edward, the future Edward I, and basically held them hostage and ruled England with them hostage until he was killed at the Battle of Evesham by Edward I in 1265. But yeah, that's the Simon de Montfort. You know, this is the bloke who's said, you know, he's the the father of Parliament. You know, he was the first one to invite the Commons to Parliament. He wasn't. It was Eleanor of Provence, but he gets the credit because he's a bloke.
He sounds like the kind of guy I want to punch in the face.
Yeah, you know, there's this heroic image of Simon de Montfort, and every time I read about him, I want to punch him. I'm like, he wasn't. You know, he tended to be. He was complaining about all the foreigners around Henry III, you know, because Eleanor of Provence's family had come to England seeking their fortune. And then Henry III's half-brothers came to England after Isabella of Angoulême died. And one of them was given the earldom of Pembroke, which had belonged to William Marshal. And so he was complaining that all these foreigners were coming in. Sound familiar? All these foreigners were coming in and getting jobs and land that he thought should be his. Probably not mentioning the fact that he was a foreigner himself who'd come in from France to seek his fortune. Just like all these other foreigners. So yeah, there's this heroic cult of Simon de Montfort, and I'm like thinking, he's a bit of a hypocrite if you ask me.
Yeah, it just sounds like a lot of greed and entitlement.
Yeah.
That's the only way I know how to he felt like, I deserve this. Why isn't it mine?
Yeah, he comes across like that. And to be honest, most people I've met, even the ones who are who write his biography and that, they do nowadays, most of them are like, yeah, he was flawed.
He's flawed. That's an understatement.
Yeah. But he's fascinating as well, though. The story of Simon de Montfort.
Yeah.
I mean, I've once wrote an article that's in a book called Kings and Queens on Henry III, and my first lines in the essay are like, Henry III isn't even the most famous man in his kingdom, in his reign, you know. If you asked anybody who do you know more about, Henry III or Simon de Montfort, most of them will go with Simon de Montfort.
Yeah, yeah. You're so right, because I feel like Henry III is like an afterthought. Like, oh, just another Henry.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, whereas Simon de Montfort, I mean, isn't he the father of Parliament?
Right.
Didn't he create the House of Commons? Didn't he fight for freedom and justice, and and wasn't he murdered at Evesham? Isn't that why they call it the murder of Evesham? And and yeah. So
History.
Eleanor was married to Simon de Montfort. And she was totally behind him as well. All through the de Montfort rebellion, you see her holding, when Henry III's son Edward, the future Edward I, was taken prisoner, it was Eleanor's custody that he was put into. So she was definitely wholeheartedly behind her husband, and had Edward in her custody. And then at the time of the Battle of Evesham, she was actually holding on to Dover Castle.
Oh.
Which was being besieged at the time. So she was in command of Dover that was being besieged, and she had to be told a few days after the battle that Simon was dead. And she still, even though she knew her husband was dead, she was still holding on to Dover until she worked out what she was going to do with, and her son as well, her eldest son, Henry, died at the battle. So it must have been a devastating time for her. And to be holding this castle, and your husband, who she obviously adored, and your eldest son are dead, and her other son, Simon, was on the run. And she had, I think they had, I can't remember if it's 4 or 5 sons.
Wow. That's a lot of sons either way.
Yeah. Yeah, when you can't remember how many there are, that means there's a lot. And then one daughter, who was also called Eleanor, just to make life easier.
I love medieval history. I always tell people, you think my true passion is the Tudors, because my podcast started out as the Tudors, but really my first passion was the Wars of the Roses and medieval history. And the more we talk about medieval history, the more you realize how much it affected the Tudors and later dynasties as well.
Oh, yes, definitely. And I think also now, I think the medieval women and their stories we couldn't have had this conversation 20 years ago. It just there wasn't the interest in it, mainly because people didn't realize that there was a subject there, the women's medieval history, that there was enough to write about in any significance. So it's brilliant that it's coming to the fore now, and that we're looking away from the Tudors and going, what about other women? What about before then? Oh, there's Eleanor of Aquitaine. Yes, there's Eleanor of Aquitaine, but there's also Nicola de la Haye. There's the Queens of Scotland. There's the Queens of France. There's so many amazing women. Maud de Breaux's. It's not just about the men anymore. And I do love that. I know, I'm hoping that just my small contribution to it has helped to get people interested in it, and to know that it wasn't just sitting down and women sitting down, girls married at a young age, then sitting down and spending their entire lives raising children and doing embroidery.
Right, yeah.
There was a lot more to these women than I always think of. We always used to call it kittens and embroidery. That's what women are good at. And it's like, no, women have always done so much more. And when you think to be married off into Germany, not as a trophy wife, but as someone who had a job to do in keeping the diplomatic channels open, that's an incredible responsibility for a young woman.
Yes, for sure. For sure. Well,
Sharon,
Sharon,
maybe we need to look at the fact that their fathers and their brothers trusted them enough to be these links, you know, and actually credit them with a bit more nous, a bit more intelligence than we have done in the past.
I think you are leading the way on that when it comes to all the books that you've written, all the research that you've done, Sharon. And I've really enjoyed this chat today. As always, you and I could talk for 2 hours. We've already been at it for at least an hour. So I want to give you.
Oh, and can we just say that Rebecca contacted me yesterday and said, "Oh, Sharon, do you want to have a chat?" So if I've got any facts mixed up or anything, it's because I didn't actually have time to revise, and they're just straight off the top of my head.
I can always count on Sharon. I can always count on her when I'm like, "Hey, I want to do an episode." And I know I want to do women in history. I know I can count on Sharon to be able to help me out if I'm in a pinch. So thank you, Sharon.
My pleasure.
I want you to make sure you have an opportunity to pitch all of the stuff that you have done in the past and tell people where they can find your books.
Well, let's see if I can remember them all. Heroines of the Medieval World, Silk and the Sword, Ladies of Magna Carta, Women of Influence in 13th Century England. That's the one that, if you're interested in these women, get Ladies of Magna Carta. What came next? Defenders of the Norman Crown. Then King John's Right-Hand Lady, the story of Nicola de la Haye, which also is relevant to our conversation today. Then Women of the Anarchy, if you're interested in Empress Matilda. Heroines of the Tudor World, just as a little change out of the my usual medieval comfort zone. And then Scotland's Medieval Queens, which, again, relevant to today. And coming out next March will be Princesses of the Early Middle Ages, which include all the girls I've spoken about today.
Oh, I very much look forward to that book. All of your books are fantastic. I really recommend that you go out and buy Sharon Bennett Connolly's books today because you will not be disappointed. Sharon, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca. Lovely as always. I've really enjoyed it. I don't think I've stopped smiling since we started talking.
That's how
face aches.
That's how you know we're having a good time, right?
Yeah, definitely.
All right, Sharon, until next time.
Thank you.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron-exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.